In the quiet suburbs of Denver, a mother's concern grows with each passing sleepless night as her teenage son's mysterious nocturnal activities threaten to unravel their family's stability. What begins as typical adolescent behavior soon reveals itself as something far more complex, leading to a discovery that will challenge everything she thought she knew about her child's character and the hidden dangers lurking in their seemingly peaceful neighborhood. Sarah Hendricks stood in the hallway at 2:47 a.m., her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor as she pressed her ear against her son's bedroom door. The familiar blue glow seeped from beneath the crack, accompanied by the soft murmur of voices she couldn't quite make out. This had become her nightly ritual over the past 2 months, checking on Marcus, wondering what had transformed her once reliable teenager into a nocturnal stranger. She knocked gently. "Marcus, honey, you need to get some sleep." "I'm fine, Mom." His voice carried that same weary edge it had developed lately, thick with exhaustion, but stubbornly alert. "Just finishing up some homework." "At 3 in the morning?" Sarah tried to keep the frustration from her voice, but she could hear it creeping in despite her best efforts. "You have school in 5 hours. I know what time it is." The conversation ended there, as it always did. Marcus had mastered the art of giving just enough response to avoid an argument while revealing absolutely nothing. Sarah stared at the door for another moment, then retreated to her own room, knowing she wouldn't sleep either. The next morning painted a familiar scene in the Hendricks kitchen. Marcus sat hunched over a bowl of cereal, his dark hair falling across eyes rimmed with exhaustion. At 16, he'd inherited his father's tall frame and Sarah's stubborn jawline, but lately he looked like a shadow of himself. His shoulders curved inward as if he were trying to disappear, and the confident smile that had once lit up their dinner conversations had become a rare visitor. "You look terrible," Sarah said, setting her coffee mug on the counter with more force than necessary. Marcus glanced up briefly. "Thanks. Really helps with my self-esteem." "I'm serious, Marcus. This can't continue. Dr. Peterson said insomnia in teenagers usually indicates I'm not seeing a therapist." Marcus pushed his bowl away, the spoon clattering against the ceramic. "There's nothing wrong with me." "Then explain to me why you're awake every night until dawn. What's so important that you're willing to destroy your health over it?" Marcus grabbed his backpack from the chair, slinging it over one shoulder with practiced indifference. "I'm just a night owl. Some people are. Night owls sleep during the day. You're barely functioning." Sarah followed him toward the front door. "Your grades are slipping. You quit the debate team. And when was the last time you hung out with Jake or Connor?" The mention of his former best friends made Marcus pause at the door, his hand on the knob. For a moment, Sarah thought she might finally break through whatever wall he'd built around himself. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and opened the door. "I'll try to sleep earlier tonight," he said, though they both knew it was a lie. After Marcus left for school, Sarah stood in the kitchen surrounded by the debris of another failed conversation. She'd read every parenting article she could find about teenage sleep issues, consulted their family doctor, and even reached out to Marcus's guidance counselor. Everyone offered the same generic advice: be patient, maintain boundaries, consider therapy. None of them had to watch their child slowly disappearing behind a screen every night. She climbed the stairs to Marcus's room, something she'd avoided doing when he was home out of respect for his privacy. The space still smelled like the lavender fabric softener she used on his sheets, mixed with the lingering scent of the energy drinks he'd started consuming despite her protests. His bed was unmade, the comforter twisted as though he'd attempted sleep before giving up entirely. Sarah sat on the edge of the mattress and surveyed the room that had once been filled with soccer trophies and model airplanes. Now it felt sparse, almost transient, as if Marcus were camping there rather than living there. His laptop sat closed on the desk, surrounded by empty water bottles and crumpled homework assignments. She resisted the urge to open it, knowing that crossing that line would shatter whatever trust remained between them. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Linda. "How's Marcus doing? Still having sleep issues?" Sarah typed back, "Getting worse. Don't know what else to try. Maybe it's just a phase. Remember when you went through that weird poetry writing period in high school?" The comparison stung because it minimized what felt like a genuine crisis. This wasn't a creative phase or typical teenage rebellion. Something was fundamentally wrong, and Sarah's maternal instincts screamed warnings she couldn't ignore. That evening, She attempted a different approach. Instead of confronting Marcus directly, she suggested they order pizza and watch a movie together, something they hadn't done in months. To her surprise, he agreed, though she noticed he kept checking his phone throughout the entire film. "Remember when we used to have movie nights every Friday?" Sarah asked during a quiet moment in the comedy they'd chosen. "Yeah." Marcus's response was automatic, his attention clearly elsewhere. "We could start doing that again. I miss spending time with you." For the first time in weeks, Marcus looked directly at her. His eyes held an exhaustion that went deeper than missed sleep, something that looked almost like grief. "I miss it too," he said quietly. "But I can't right now. There's something I have to—" He caught himself, the walls slamming back into place. "I mean, I've got a lot going on with school and stuff." "What kind of stuff? Maybe I could help." Marcus shook his head, already retreating. "It's not something you can help with, Mom. Some things I have to handle myself." The conversation died there, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. After Marcus excused himself to his room, she sat alone in the living room, staring at credits rolling on the television screen. She'd raised Marcus to be independent and thoughtful, but somewhere along the way, those qualities had transformed into isolation and secrecy. Around midnight, she heard the familiar sounds from upstairs, the soft click of his laptop opening, the gentle hum of voices through his headphones. She crept up the stairs and saw the blue light emanating from beneath his door, casting strange shadows in the hallway. This time, instead of knocking, Sarah pressed her ear more firmly against the door. She could make out fragments of conversation, though Marcus's voice was barely audible. What she heard made her blood run cold. "Still there?" "Yeah, I can see the back door from this angle. Need to keep watching. What if something happens and no one—" "Can't sleep until I know it's safe." Sarah jerked back from the door, her heart pounding. Marcus wasn't just staying up late watching videos or playing games. He was watching something, or someone. The protective tone in his voice, the references to safety and surveillance, painted a picture that terrified her more than typical teenage rebellion ever could. She returned to her room, but didn't even attempt sleep. Instead, she sat by her window, staring across the street at the quiet neighborhood that had always felt like a safe haven. The Thompson house stood dark and empty. They'd moved to Florida 6 months ago. The Martinez family next door had their porch light on, as always, and directly across from Marcus's bedroom window sat Mrs. Chen's small colonial, where the elderly woman lived alone with her 2 cats. As Sarah watched, she noticed something she'd never observed before, a faint glow coming from one of Mrs. Chen's upstairs windows, visible only because Sarah was looking from this specific angle at this unusual hour. It could be a nightlight, or perhaps Mrs. Chen was having her own sleepless night. But as Sarah continued to stare, she began to wonder if that glow might be connected to whatever was keeping her son awake. The way Marcus had spoken about watching and keeping things safe, combined with his clear view of Mrs. Chen's house from his bedroom window, started to form a picture that both impressed and worried her. Sarah made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months ago, when she still trusted that her relationship with Marcus was built on open communication. Tomorrow, while Marcus was at school, she would find a way to discover what he was really doing during those long, sleepless nights. She couldn't shake the feeling that her son was trying to protect someone, but she also couldn't ignore the possibility that he might be putting himself, or others, in danger. Whatever the truth was, she needed to know. The boy who had once told her everything had become a stranger living under her roof, and the time for respecting his privacy had passed. As dawn approached and the mysterious glow across the street finally disappeared, Sarah heard Marcus's laptop close and his bed springs creak as he finally attempted to get a few hours of rest before school. She remained at her window, watching Mrs. Chen's house in the growing daylight, wondering what secrets the darkness had been hiding and what price her son might be paying to guard them. The next morning, Sarah waited until Marcus's bus disappeared around the corner before she allowed herself to fully consider what she was about to do. Breaking into her son's private space felt like crossing a line she'd never imagined she'd approach, but the fragments of conversation she'd overheard the night before left her with no choice. Words like watching, safe, and back door circled in her mind like warning sirens. She stood outside Marcus's bedroom door for a full 5 minutes, her hand hovering over the doorknob. In 16 years of parenting, She'd prided herself on building trust rather than conducting surveillance. But trust required communication, and Marcus had made it clear that avenue was closed. The room looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more like the space of a tired teenager struggling with something beyond his capacity to handle. Sarah moved carefully around the unmade bed, searching for clues without disturbing the careful chaos that Marcus might notice. His laptop sat closed on the desk, password protected and legally off limits, despite her desperation to peek inside. But it was the positioning of his desk chair that caught her attention. Instead of facing the computer directly, it was angled toward the window that looked out over Mrs. Chen's house. Sarah sat in the chair and immediately understood why. From this exact position, Marcus had a clear view of Mrs. Chen's backyard, her kitchen window and the side entrance she used for her daily walks. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her friend Janet. "Coffee later? Need to vent about teenage drama." She almost laughed at the timing. Janet's idea of teenage drama involved arguments over curfew and complaints about chores. Sarah was dealing with something that felt infinitely more complex and potentially dangerous. Instead of responding, Sarah found herself walking to her own computer and researching small surveillance cameras. The options were overwhelming. Tiny devices that could be hidden anywhere, some no bigger than a button, others disguised as everyday objects. She felt sick as she clicked through product descriptions, knowing she was about to become the kind of parent she'd always judged. An hour later, she stood in the electronics section of Best Buy, holding a wireless camera the size of a USB drive. The young sales associate, who couldn't have been much older than Marcus, explained how easy it was to set up. "You just download the app, connect it to your Wi-Fi, and you can watch the feed from anywhere," he said cheerfully. Popular with parents who want to keep an eye on babysitters or elderly folks checking on their pets during the day. Sarah nodded, wondering what category her situation fell into. She wasn't checking on a babysitter or a pet. She was spying on her own child because he'd become a stranger to her. Back home, she installed the tiny camera on Marcus's bookshelf, positioning it behind a row of his old fantasy novels, where it would be invisible unless someone was specifically looking for it. The setup process took less than 10 minutes, but each step felt like a betrayal of everything she'd tried to teach Marcus about honesty and trust. The app on her phone showed a clear view of Marcus's desk and the window beyond. She could see Mrs. Chen's house in the background, peaceful and ordinary in the afternoon sunlight. Whatever Marcus was watching for wasn't apparent during daylight hours. Sarah spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous anticipation mixed with overwhelming guilt. She cooked Marcus's favorite dinner, lasagna with garlic bread, partly as an attempt at normalcy and partly as a peace offering for the violation she'd committed against his privacy. When Marcus came home from school, he looked even more exhausted than usual. His backpack seemed to weigh him down as he trudged through the kitchen, barely acknowledging the meal she'd prepared. "How was school?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice light. "Fine." Marcus grabbed a piece of garlic bread and headed toward the stairs. "Wait, I made your favorite. Can't you sit and eat with me?" Marcus paused at the bottom of the staircase, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might actually join her. Instead, he turned back with an expression that looked almost apologetic. "I'm really tired, Mom. I have things I need to do tonight." "What things, Marcus? You keep saying that, but you never tell me what's so important that you're willing to make yourself sick over it." "It's not," Marcus started, then stopped himself. "It's complicated. Try me. I'm smarter than you think." For a moment, Marcus looked like he might actually explain. His shoulders sagged, and Sarah could see the weight of whatever he was carrying in the dark circles under his eyes, and the way he couldn't quite meet her gaze. "Someone needs me to pay attention," he said finally. "If I don't watch, something bad might happen." "Watch what?" "Marcus, you're scaring me." But the moment of openness had passed. Marcus shook his head and headed upstairs, leaving Sarah alone with her lasagna and more questions than ever. At 11:30 p.m., Sarah lay in her bed with her phone, the surveillance app open and waiting. She felt like a criminal, but she also felt like a mother running out of options. The camera showed Marcus's empty room, his unmade bed visible in the corner of the frame. At 11:47, Marcus entered the room and immediately went to his desk. Sarah watched as he opened his laptop and put on his headphones, but instead of the casual posture of someone watching entertainment videos, he sat with the focused attention of someone on duty. His back was straight, his head tilted toward his computer screen, and every few minutes he would glance up at his window to look directly at Mrs. Chen's house. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized she could see Marcus's laptop screen reflected in his window. It wasn't Netflix or YouTube or even video games. The reflection showed what looked like a grid of small video windows, multiple camera feeds displaying different angles of what she was increasingly certain was Mrs. Chen's property. She watched for 2 hours as Marcus maintained his vigil, occasionally typing something on his keyboard or adjusting his position for a better view. He never relaxed, never appeared to be enjoying whatever he was watching. This wasn't entertainment, it was surveillance, conducted with the serious attention of someone who genuinely believed he was protecting something or someone. At 1:30 a.m., Marcus suddenly sat up straighter, his attention focused on something Sarah couldn't see. He pulled off his headphones and moved closer to his laptop screen, his face tense with concentration. Then he grabbed his phone and appeared to be texting someone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized she was watching her son respond to some kind of security situation. Whatever he was monitoring had triggered an alert, and he was taking action. But what kind of action? And who was he communicating with at 1:30 in the morning? Marcus put his headphones back on and returned to watching, but his posture remained alert for another hour. Only when he finally seemed to relax did Sarah realize she'd been holding her breath for most of the night. At 3:15 a.m., Marcus finally closed his laptop and attempted to get some sleep. Sarah stared at her phone screen, which now showed only her son's sleeping form, curled up on top of his comforter, too exhausted to even get under the covers properly. She had her answer, but it only led to more disturbing questions. Marcus had somehow gained access to security cameras, monitoring their elderly neighbor's property, and he was spending his nights watching for threats that apparently were real enough to require middle-of-the-night text alerts. Sarah barely slept for the remaining few hours before dawn. By the time Marcus's alarm went off, she was already in the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, preparing for a conversation that could either rebuild their relationship or destroy what little trust remained between them. When Marcus came downstairs, moving like a zombie and reaching automatically for the energy drinks she'd asked him to stop consuming, Sarah was ready. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Marcus paused with the drink halfway to his lips. "Mom, I'm already going to be late for school. About Mrs. Chen's security cameras." The energy drink slipped from Marcus's hand, clattering on the kitchen counter and spraying liquid across the granite surface. His face went completely white, and for a moment Sarah thought he might actually faint. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice cracked on the lie. "Yes, you do. I know you're watching her house every night. I know you have access to her security system. And I know that whatever you're watching for, you believe it's real enough to lose sleep over." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through denial, anger, and finally defeat. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "How long have you known? I figured it out last night. But Marcus, I need you to explain to me what's going on. Why are you monitoring Mrs. Chen's house? Does she know you're doing this, and what exactly are you watching for?" Marcus sank into one of the kitchen chairs, looking suddenly much younger than his 16 years. "She asked me to help her set up some cameras a couple months ago. It was supposed to be just a school project for community service hours. But it became more than that. She was scared, Mom. Really scared. She said someone had been calling her house and hanging up, and she found weird letters in her mailbox. She didn't want to worry anyone, but she couldn't afford a professional security company." Sarah felt her anger beginning to shift toward concern. "So you offered to watch her cameras at night?" "Someone needs to," Marcus said, and there was something fierce in his voice that reminded Sarah of the determined little boy who used to insist on checking all the locks before bedtime. "She's 83 years old and lives alone. If something happens and no one's paying attention..." "Marcus, this isn't your responsibility. If Mrs. Chen is receiving threats, she needs to call the police." She did. They said without evidence of actual harm, there wasn't much they could do. The letters weren't technically threatening, just weird, and anyone can make prank phone calls. Sarah stared at her son, seeing him clearly for the first time in months. The exhaustion, the secrecy, the stubborn dedication. It wasn't rebellion or typical teenage problems. Marcus had appointed himself as Mrs. Chen's protector, and he was slowly destroying his health trying to be a one-person security service. "Show me," Sarah said quietly. "What?" "Show me the camera feeds. Show me what you've been watching for." Marcus looked surprised, then wary. "You're not going to make me stop. I'm going to help you figure out a better way to help Mrs. Chen. But first, I need to understand what we're dealing with." For the first time in months, Marcus looked at his mother with something approaching relief. "Okay," he said. "But Mom, some of what I've recorded, it's not good." Marcus led Sarah upstairs to his room, moving with the careful steps of someone who'd been carrying a heavy secret for too long. As they entered his space together, Sarah noticed details she'd missed during her earlier investigation. The small notebook beside his computer filled with timestamps and observations, the binoculars on his windowsill, and a printed map of their neighborhood with Mrs. Chen's property circled in red ink. "I started keeping records after the first week," Marcus explained, opening his laptop and pulling up what looked like a security monitoring interface. "Mrs. Chen said the police wanted documentation if anything escalated." The screen displayed 4 camera angles: Mrs. Chen's front porch, backyard, side entrance, and a view of her driveway from the street. Each feed was time-stamped and showed different areas of the elderly woman's modest property in crystal clear detail. "How did you set all this up?" Sarah asked, impressed despite her concern. "This looks professional." "YouTube University," Marcus said with a tired smile. The first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him in weeks. Mrs. Chen had bought some basic cameras online but couldn't figure out how to install them or connect them to the internet. "It took me 3 weekends to get everything working properly." Sarah studied the feeds, noting how they provided comprehensive coverage of Mrs. Chen's home. "When did she first tell you about the threats?" Marcus pulled up his notebook and flipped to an early entry. "September 15th. She mentioned getting weird phone calls during my first visit to help with the cameras. By September 22nd, when I came back to finish the installation, she'd gotten 3 more calls and found the first letter." "What kind of letter?" Marcus hesitated, then opened a folder on his desktop labeled Evidence. Inside were photographs of several handwritten notes, each one more disturbing than the last. The first was relatively benign: "You can't stay here forever." But they escalated quickly to more specific threats about Mrs. Chen being too old to live alone safely, and references to accidents that happened to elderly people. Sarah felt her stomach clench as she read through the photographed threats. "Marcus, these are serious. This isn't just prank calls. Someone is deliberately trying to intimidate Mrs. Chen." "I know, that's why I started watching every night. Look at this." Marcus pulled up a video file dated October 3rd. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m., and the footage was from the backyard camera. Sarah watched as a figure in dark clothing moved through Mrs. Chen's yard, checking windows and trying the back door handle. The person was careful to stay in the shadows, but their behavior was clearly that of someone testing the security of the house. "Did you call the police when this happened?" Mrs. Chen did the next morning, but by then the person was long gone, and there wasn't much physical evidence. The officer was nice, but said, without seeing the person's face or catching them in the act of actually breaking something, it was just trespassing. Sarah continued watching as Marcus showed her more footage from different nights. The pattern was disturbing. Someone was regularly checking Mrs. Chen's property, always between 2 and 4 a.m., always careful to avoid being clearly identified on camera. But as the weeks progressed, the person became bolder, spending longer periods testing doors and windows. "This is why you can't sleep," Sarah realized. "You're trying to catch this person in the act." "Someone has to," Marcus said, and there was that fierce protectiveness again. "Mrs. Chen's hearing isn't great and she takes sleeping medication. If someone actually tried to break in, she might not wake up in time to call for help." Sarah felt a complex mix of pride and terror as she understood the full scope of what her son had been doing. For 2 months, Marcus had been conducting a one-person neighborhood watch, sacrificing his sleep and health to protect their vulnerable neighbor. "But Marcus, this is too much for you to handle alone. You're just 16. Age doesn't matter when someone needs help," Marcus interrupted. "Besides, I've been documenting everything. Look." He showed her a detailed log he'd been keeping, noting times, descriptions of suspicious activity, and cross-references to the security footage. The work was meticulous and thorough, the kind of documentation that professional security services would charge thousands of dollars to provide. Have you shared this with Mrs. Chen? Some of it. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was, but after last night, Marcus pulled up the most recent video file. The footage from the previous evening showed the mysterious figure spending nearly 20 minutes systematically checking every possible entry point to Mrs. Chen's house. This time, the person had brought tools, what looked like a screwdriver or small pry bar, and had actually attempted to force the lock on the side door before something spooked them into leaving. "This is attempted breaking and entering," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. "This footage needs to go to the police immediately. I texted Mrs. Chen about it last night, but she hasn't responded yet. I think she turns her phone off at night." Sarah stood up, her mind racing through the implications of what she'd learned. Her son wasn't just losing sleep over teenage problems, he was conducting genuine security work for a neighbor who was being systematically stalked and threatened. The weight of responsibility he'd taken on was staggering, and the fact that he'd been handling it alone made her both proud and heartbroken. "We need to go talk to Mrs. Chen right now," Sarah said, "and then we're calling the police together. This has gone far beyond what you should be handling by yourself. But what if they make me stop monitoring the cameras? What if something happens to her?" Sarah saw the genuine fear in her son's eyes, not fear for himself, but fear for Mrs. Chen's safety. "We're going to make sure she's protected, Marcus, but we're going to do it the right way, with proper adult support and police involvement." They walked across the street together, Sarah carrying Marcus's laptop with all the documented evidence. Mrs. Chen's house looked peaceful in the morning sunlight, giving no indication of the nighttime terror that had been plaguing its elderly occupant. Mrs. Chen answered the door after several rings, looking frail and tired. She was a small woman, probably barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When she saw Marcus, her face lit up with genuine affection. "Marcus, what a wonderful surprise, and you must be his mother. He's told me so much about you." "Mrs. Chen, I'm Sarah Hendricks. I think we need to have a serious conversation about what's been happening here." Mrs. Chen's expression immediately became worried. "Is this about the cameras? I hope Marcus isn't getting in trouble for helping me. He's been such a blessing." "He's not in trouble," Sarah assured her, "but we're very concerned about your safety. Marcus has been monitoring your security system every night, and what he's recorded suggests you're dealing with something much more serious than prank calls." Mrs. Chen invited them inside, and Sarah was struck by how neat and organized everything was. Family photos covered every surface, and the air smelled like jasmine tea and old books. This was clearly the home of someone who'd lived a full life and deserved to feel safe in her own space. "I didn't want to be a burden to anyone," Mrs. Chen said as they sat in her living room. "My nephew keeps telling me I should move to a senior community, that this house is too much for me to handle alone. But I've lived here for 37 years. My husband and I raised our children here. Tell my mom about the letters and phone calls," Marcus urged gently. Mrs. Chen sighed and retrieved a small box from her kitchen. Inside were the actual threat letters, along with a notebook where she'd been recording the times and dates of the harassing phone calls. Sarah read through everything, her anger growing with each item. "Mrs. Chen, these threats are escalating, and based on what Marcus has captured on video, someone has been testing your security almost every night for weeks. Last night, they actually tried to force your side door lock." Mrs. Chen's face went pale. "I didn't hear anything last night. I took an extra sleeping pill because I was feeling anxious." Marcus pulled up the video on his laptop and showed Mrs. Chen the footage from the previous evening. As she watched the dark figure moving around her property with tools, trying to break into her home, tears began streaming down her cheeks. "I've been trying so hard not to be scared," she whispered. "But seeing this, knowing someone was right outside while I was sleeping..." Sarah moved to sit beside Mrs. Chen, taking her hand. "You don't have to be scared alone anymore. We're going to help you, and we're going to make sure the police take this seriously. But what if calling the police makes things worse? What if this person gets angry and does something more dangerous? What if we don't call them and this person escalates anyway?" Sarah countered gently. "Mrs. Chen, you have the right to feel safe in your own home, and Marcus has documented enough evidence to prove this is a serious threat." Marcus sat forward in his chair. "I'll keep watching the cameras either way, but Mom's right. We need professional help. This is getting too dangerous for just me to handle." Mrs. Chen looked between Sarah and Marcus, seeing the genuine concern and determination in both their faces. "You've both been so kind to me. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank us," Sarah said. "This is what neighbors do for each other." They spent the next hour going through all of Marcus's documentation, organizing the evidence into a coherent timeline that would be easy for police to understand. As they worked, Sarah began to notice details about Mrs. Chen's situation that painted a clearer picture of her vulnerability. The house was large for one person, with multiple entry points that would be difficult for an elderly woman to secure properly. Mrs. Chen mentioned that her nearest family members lived several states away, and her social circle had shrunk significantly since her husband's death 3 years earlier. She was exactly the kind of target that predators looked for: isolated, elderly, and living in a valuable piece of property. "Mrs. Chen," Sarah said carefully, "you mentioned your nephew thinks you should move to a senior community. How often does he visit?" "Oh, David comes by every few weeks. He's very concerned about me living alone, especially since these problems started. He keeps saying I'd be safer somewhere with more people around." Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances. The timing seemed suspiciously convenient. A nephew pushing for relocation just as threatening incidents began escalating. "What does David do for work?" Sarah asked. "He's in real estate development, very successful. He's always been good with money and investments." Another red flag. Sarah was beginning to suspect that Mrs. Chen's threats might not be coming from random strangers, but she kept her theories to herself until they could present everything to the police. As they prepared to leave Mrs. Chen's house, the elderly woman took Marcus's hands in hers. "Thank you for watching over me," she said. "I can't believe you've been losing sleep to keep me safe. Your parents raised a very special young man." Marcus blushed, but Sarah could see how much Mrs. Chen's gratitude meant to him. For the first time in months, her son looked like he felt genuinely good about something. "I'm going to keep watching tonight," Marcus told Mrs. Chen, "but tomorrow we'll have talked to the police, and hopefully we can get some better protection set up for you." As they walked back across the street, Sarah put her arm around her son's shoulders. "I'm proud of you, Marcus. What you've been doing for Mrs. Chen is incredible. But from now on, you don't have to carry this responsibility alone." "Thanks, Mum. I was starting to wonder if I was crazy, thinking this was as serious as it seemed." "You weren't crazy. Your instincts were right, and tomorrow we're going to make sure Mrs. Chen gets the protection she deserves." That night, Sarah sat with Marcus during his vigil, both of them monitoring Mrs. Chen's cameras and hoping their mysterious stalker wouldn't realize that his time was running out. The next morning, Sarah and Marcus sat in the waiting area of the Denver Police Department's Community Liaison Office, surrounded by Marcus's carefully organized evidence. Detective Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying temples, had agreed to review their case after Sarah's persistent phone calls, emphasizing the escalating nature of the threats. "I have to admit, I'm impressed by the thoroughness of this documentation," Detective Santos said as she reviewed Marcus's timeline and video evidence. "Most professional security companies don't keep records this detailed." Marcus shifted nervously in his chair. "I just wanted to make sure everything was accurate in case Mrs. Chen needed it for legal purposes." "You did exactly the right thing. This footage clearly shows attempted breaking and entering, and the pattern of behavior suggests stalking with intent to intimidate." Detective Santos paused the video at a frame showing the intruder's tools. "The escalation is particularly concerning. Whoever this is, they're getting bolder." Sarah leaned forward. "What can you do to protect Mrs. Chen?" "With this evidence, I can get approval for increased patrols in the area and will install a direct panic button system connected to dispatch. But I'm also going to recommend that Mrs. Chen consider staying with family or friends until we identify the perpetrator." "She doesn't have family nearby," Marcus said. "Just a nephew who lives about an hour away." Detective Santos made a note. "Tell me about this nephew. Does he visit regularly?" Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. "That's something we wanted to discuss with you," Sarah said carefully. "The timing of his visits and his suggestions that Mrs. Chen should move seem coincidental." "His name is David Chen, and he works in real estate development," Marcus added. "Mrs. Chen mentioned he's been pushing her to sell the house and move to a senior community." Detective Santos's expression became more focused. "How long has he been suggesting this?" "According to Mrs. Chen, the conversations about moving started around the same time the threatening calls began, Sarah replied. I'll need to do some background research on Mr. David Chen. In the meantime, I want you both to continue monitoring the cameras, but I'm also assigning an undercover officer to patrol the area during the overnight hours when these incidents typically occur. As they left the police station, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and continued worry. Professional help was finally involved, but they still didn't know who was threatening Mrs. Chen or when the next escalation might occur. That afternoon, Marcus showed Sarah something that made her blood run cold. While reviewing footage from the past week, he'd noticed that the mysterious intruder seemed to know exactly where each camera was positioned and had been deliberately avoiding clear shots of his face. Look at this, Marcus said, pointing to a sequence where the figure moved from shadow to shadow with practiced precision. He's not just some random burglar. He knows about the security system. You think it's someone who's been in Mrs. Chen's house before, or someone who helped plan the camera placement, Marcus said quietly. The implication hung between them like a dark cloud. David Chen had been present during several of Marcus's visits to install the security system. He would know exactly where each camera was positioned and how to avoid them. That evening they maintained their vigil with new urgency. Sarah had called in sick to work, unable to concentrate on anything else while Mrs. Chen remained in danger. As they watched the multiple camera feeds, Sarah found herself studying every shadow, every movement in the neighboring yards. At 11:47 p.m., Marcus suddenly sat up straighter. "Mom, look at camera 3. The side yard camera showed a figure approaching Mrs. Chen's house, but this time the person wasn't trying to hide. They walked directly to the front door and knocked, not the tentative tap of someone unsure of their welcome, but the confident knock of someone who expected to be admitted. "Should we call 911?" Sarah asked, reaching for her phone. "Wait," Marcus said, adjusting the camera angle with his software. "I want to see who this is." Mrs. Chen appeared at her front door in her bathrobe, and through the glass they could see her having a conversation with her visitor. After a moment, she opened the door and let the person inside. "She knows whoever this is," Sarah observed. "The question is whether she feels safe letting them in, or whether she felt like she had no choice," Marcus replied grimly. They watched for 20 minutes as lights moved around inside Mrs. Chen's house. Then at 12:15 a.m., the visitor left through the front door. This time Marcus was ready with the camera positioned to catch a clear view of the person's face as they walked down the front path. The face that appeared on their screen was middle-aged, with graying hair and the kind of confident expression that suggested someone accustomed to getting their way. Marcus immediately pulled up his notebook and compared the image to a photo Mrs. Chen had shown them earlier. "It's David," Marcus said with certainty. "It's her nephew. But why would he visit this late at night, and why did he knock like he belonged there?" Marcus was already reviewing earlier footage, cross-referencing timestamps and looking for patterns. "Mom, I think I've been watching the wrong thing. Look at this." He pulled up footage from 3 nights earlier, focusing on the timestamp when the mysterious intruder had appeared. Then he overlaid it with phone records Mrs. Chen had shared, showing when she'd received threatening calls. Every time someone breaks into her yard, Mrs. Chen gets a threatening phone call the next day. And every time she gets a call, David visits within 48 hours to talk about how unsafe she is living alone. Sarah stared at the evidence Marcus had compiled, seeing the pattern he'd identified. "You think David is behind all of this?" "I think David is creating the problems so he can offer the solution." Mrs. Chen owns a valuable piece of property in a developing neighborhood. If she moves to a senior community, what happens to the house? As her closest family member, he'd probably handle the sale, Sarah realized. Marcus nodded grimly. And as a real estate developer, he'd know exactly how much that property is worth and how to maximize the profit from selling it. They called Detective Santos immediately, even though it was past midnight. To their relief, she answered on the second ring. "Detective Santos, this is Sarah Hendricks. We have an urgent development in Mrs. Chen's case." "What's happened?" Sarah explained what they'd witnessed and Marcus's analysis of the pattern connecting the break-ins, phone calls, and David's visits. Detective Santos listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about timestamps and evidence. "I want you to send me all of that footage immediately," Detective Santos said when Sarah finished. "And I'm dispatching officers to Mrs. Chen's house right now to do a welfare check." Should we go over there? No, stay where you are and keep monitoring. If David Chen is manipulating his aunt through fear tactics, having witnesses to his late-night visit could be crucial evidence. 20 minutes later, they watched through the cameras as 2 police officers knocked on Mrs. Chen's door. The elderly woman appeared surprised but let them inside. Through the living room window, they could see what appeared to be an intense conversation. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. "Police here asking about David. Can you come over tomorrow morning? I need to talk to you both." Neither Sarah nor Marcus slept that night, but for the first time in months it wasn't because Marcus was conducting surveillance. They were both too keyed up thinking about the implications of what they'd discovered and worried about Mrs. Chen's emotional state. The next morning, they found Mrs. Chen sitting at her kitchen table with Detective Santos, looking exhausted but more alert than she'd seemed in weeks. "I feel so foolish," Mrs. Chen said as soon as they sat down. "David has been manipulating me for months and I was too scared and confused to see it clearly." Detective Santos consulted her notes. "Mrs. Chen has confirmed that David has been pressuring her to sell the house and move to a senior facility, where he's invested in the development company. When she refused, the threatening incidents began. But David was trying to help me feel safer," Mrs. Chen said, still struggling to accept the betrayal. "He kept saying I should move somewhere with better security. Security that he was undermining every time he paid someone to lurk around your property," Detective Santos explained gently. "We arrested David early this morning, along with an associate he'd been paying to conduct the nighttime harassment. He's confessed to orchestrating the entire campaign." Marcus looked stunned. "So all those nights I was watching for strangers, the real threat was someone Mrs. Chen trusted?" "Often that's how these elder abuse cases work," Detective Santos said. "Family members use fear and manipulation to convince elderly relatives to make financial decisions that benefit the abuser rather than the victim." Sarah felt a surge of anger, thinking about how David had systematically terrorized his own aunt for months, all while pretending to be concerned for her welfare. What happens now? David is facing charges for elder abuse, conspiracy, stalking, and attempted burglary. His associate is also being charged. "Mrs. Chen, you're safe now, and you can stay in your home as long as you want to." Mrs. Chen reached across the table to take Marcus's hands. "I can never thank you enough. If you hadn't been watching over me, if you hadn't documented everything so carefully, David might have succeeded in forcing me out of my home." Marcus blushed, but Sarah could see how much Mrs. Chen's gratitude meant to him. "I'm just glad you're safe now." Detective Santos gathered her materials. "Marcus, I want you to know that your documentation and surveillance work was professional grade. Have you ever considered a career in law enforcement or security?" "Actually," Marcus said, looking at his mother with a smile, "I think I'd like to study criminal justice. Maybe help other people who are in situations like Mrs. Chen's." As Detective Santos left, Sarah found herself alone with Marcus and Mrs. Chen in the sunny kitchen that had been the focus of so much fear and anxiety over the past months. "I owe you an apology too," Sarah said to Marcus. "I should have trusted you when you said something important was keeping you awake. Instead of assuming it was typical teenage problems, I should have asked better questions and listened more carefully." "It's okay, Mom. I probably should have told you what was going on from the beginning. I just felt like it was my responsibility to handle alone." "You're 16 years old, Marcus. Protecting our neighbors is something the whole community should be involved in, not something you should have to do by yourself." Mrs. Chen smiled, looking more relaxed than she had in months. "Perhaps we can set up a proper neighborhood watch program. There are other elderly residents who might benefit from having people like Marcus looking out for them. With proper adult supervision and police cooperation," Sarah added firmly. As they walked back across the street, Sarah realized that the crisis that had nearly destroyed her relationship with Marcus had actually brought them closer together. She'd learned that her son was capable of remarkable maturity and compassion, while Marcus had learned that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness. That night, for the first time in over 2 months, Marcus went to bed at a reasonable hour. Sarah checked on him around midnight and found him sleeping peacefully, his laptop closed and his surveillance notebook put away. The next morning over breakfast, Marcus looked more rested than he had in months. "So, what's the plan for tonight?" Sarah asked. "No more all-night security shifts?" Marcus grinned. "I was thinking maybe we could have one of those movie nights we used to do. I've missed hanging out with you." "I'd like that," Sarah said, pouring herself coffee and settling into her chair. "But I get to pick the movie." "Deal. As long as it's not a horror film. I think I've had enough suspense for a while." Sarah laughed, looking at her son and seeing both the mature young man he was becoming and the caring boy he'd always been. The mystery of Marcus's sleepless nights had been solved, but more importantly, they'd rediscovered their ability to trust and communicate with each other. Outside, Mrs. Chen waved from her garden, tending to her flowers in the morning sunshine, safe in her own home and surrounded by neighbors who genuinely cared about her well-being. The nightmare was over, but the relationships forged during those difficult months would last much longer. Marcus had learned that protecting others was important, but not at the expense of his own health and family relationships. Sarah had learned that sometimes the most troubling teenage behavior masks the most admirable motivations, and Mrs. Chen had learned that real security comes not from isolation, but from being part of a community that looks out for one another. As Sarah watched Marcus finish his breakfast and gather his school supplies, looking like a normal teenager for the first time in months, she realized that the mystery had taught them all valuable lessons about trust, communication, and the importance of asking for help when the burden becomes too heavy to carry alone.